Mhm.
What about those middling teams? Because the middling teams, I think this is where a lot of people are 5 and
Yeah.
3, 4 and 4, 3 and 5. And I think this is all one category. And most of these teams probably feel like they have strong teams right now.
Yeah.
I would say like
Absolutely.
there's been really good performing young players. There's a lot of studs that we drafted as studs that have not performed. We have a lot of guys coming back from injuries, Christian McCaffrey and Nico Collins. So this is also a good time for people who are like, I've been, I feel good about my team. I'm strong. I've made some trades. Mike Evans is coming back later. I'll feel good about it. But you got to stack up wins because then you're about a week
Mhm.
away or a week or two away from feeling like you're losing control of it all. So I think for the middling teams, one of my biggest tips is to stay aggressive in the trade market and not put yourself in the playoffs too early. I think that's one thing that a lot of people do is they put themselves, they're like, I have a 5 and 3 team. I'm better than the rest. I'm gonna make the playoffs. Or like, I feel
Yeah.
really good about my team. They shouldn't be a 3 and 5 team. I've scored the most points. It's like, don't take this time of the year for granted. I think you need to stack up wins, at least three, two out of the next 3 games for you. Gotta be wins if you're 5 and 3 or 3 and 5.
And one last thing I want to say about the teams that are like, down bad, the record's pretty bad, is, and this kind of goes for all of them, especially this team. You're playing the waiver wire, but you can't sit around and if your bench is like Trey Benson and Blake Corum,
Yeah.
I wouldn't wait around with those kind of guys. Like you can't afford to. You got to clear out that bench and get guys who are producing right now, like a Cedric Tillman. Like maybe he could become a guy that you're starting every single week, and maybe
Yeah.
he becomes a wide receiver too for the rest of the way. I don't know. Like those are the kind of guys that I would aggressively be going after, adding to my bench, rather than trying to wait for a guy like Blake Corum, right? Who we know the upside is massive,
Well,
but
and
he
you talk
could
about that, like,
go
you
down late.
mentioned going after a guy like Travis Etienne if you're an Owen whatever team. Actually think those are perfect players to trade away. Like, trade those to the guys that have like deep benches that picked up the
Yeah,
Kareem Hunts for free, that picked up some of these players for free, and
that
go
could be a
after
good
one
one,
of
yeah.
their players they picked up for free because it's gonna feel like they won the trade. They're
It's
like, oh,
the only and this is kind of how trading goes. It's just it all comes down in the eye of the beholder, right? Like, because I could look at it the same side and say, like, those guys who have Travis Etienne are like, my God, I just want to get this guy off my team. Where if you're a team that's down, like, I think that, like, do I think Travis Etienne is a bad player? I don't think he's a bad player. I think that Tank Bigsby's been playing really well, but I think that Travis Etienne is going to come back and he's still going to have a role.
but if you're two
So,
and six, you don't got time to wait on
but
Travis
he could come
Etienne.
back next week.
Yeah, but
Like
what work are you gonna start him?
I mean, potential. I think that Travis. I think that I think Tank Bigsby will be this team's early down kind of grinder, but Travis Etienne is going to get like the touches. You want the receiving back most of the
Yeah.
time, and he's going to be the receiving back. Like Tank is not playing on third downs. Like Dearness Johnson's out snapping him on third downs. So I think that Travis Etienne kind of goes into that. But I agree. But the only problem is like, is a championship team going to trade for Travis Etienne? Like, do they want him?
Shit,
I don't know.
that's
It's kind of like, once again, it all comes down to just preference and who these guys want. But for teams that are currently sitting around 500, you said be aggressive in trades. I think this is absolutely, you need to still be aggressive on the waivers. Like, this is where I think the waivers are separate the winners from losers. This is the time of the year where you're constantly moving players in and out,
yeah.
in and out, in and out. And there's going to be a couple of players. Maybe it's Cedric Tillman, who at the end of the year, we look back and from this time forward, he ends up being a top 12 wide receiver for the rest of the season. There's going to be another running back. There always is. Last year, Devin Singletary, was a top 12 running back or at least like a high end RB2 for the rest of the year. So this is the time of the year where, yes, I do agree. I agree. I even think that going back and, like I said earlier, trying to get like because you're taking risk where I don't think it all comes down to luck once you get into the playoffs, but you just want to get in. Where a
Yes.
guy like Michael Pittman, I think that can be a guy that's risky. He could absolutely flatline for the rest of the year, be ass, kind of like he has been the whole year. Or if they do decide to go to Flacco, which I think is a real possibility, that whole
Agreed.
passing offense gets an upgrade because I think it's who would you rather have right now? Like, because this is kind of like an internal struggle I'm having is like Josh Downs or Michael Pittman. I think people might be just because Josh Downs has some pretty good weeks and back-to-back weeks, or
Yeah, I'm still going Pittman here. I think the pedigree is still
I
there, but
think so with
it's
Pittman.
a credible, that's a real trade, because in somebody's
Yeah,
head you might be thinking like I'd rather have Downs, but I would still rather have Pittman, because but we're also like, that's the veteran side of us. You know, I mean,
yeah,
we've seen where like players maybe at sometimes they have a slow start to the season or a slow patch in the season, and then situation changes and we're like, oh, this is the talent we originally drafted. And I think we got to, sometimes too, in the middle of the year, like people get so down off of early production and where they drafted somebody.
mhm,
Last year I got killed for Najee Harris, right? Like it was, you wanted us to draft him in the top 10, and he's not a top 10 guy, so he's dropping, he's not startable. And it's like down the stretch, he became very fantasy
yeah,
relevant.
yeah.
So I think you're spot on with a
And
guy like Pittman.
why did he become fantasy relevant? Because they
Situation
finally
changed.
the situation changed. So those are the kind of guys that I would be trying to look to add that I think are just good football players. And that's kind of how I look at I think that Travis Etienne is a good football player. Like I keep coming back to it. I still think he's a good football. I think Tank is also very good. But like this situation could change where Jacksonville, they lost this past week, right? And they
Yeah,
and
yeah, I
they have
think
a
so.
kind of a tough schedule. Like they could end up firing the coach, and this situation could be just turned upside down where situation changes. So those are the kind of guys where if there's belief in you that you think these guys are good, but it just hasn't worked out, the situation
Chris
can
Olave
change.
is another
Chris
one.
Olave, I think he's a guy that I would 100% be
Derek
once
Carr
again.
on the way back. Yeah,
Amari Cooper, I cannot stress this
yeah.
enough. I would be aggressively targeting Amari Cooper in all of my leagues if those managers are down a little bit. And one other guy that I think is interesting that I think a lot of people might be kind of coming off of a little bit is a guy like Jaden Reed. And the reason
Yep.
being is because he's been a little bit disappointing as of late. Now you might have Jordan Love out this week, then they have a bye. So maybe it's not the right time to trade right now. But if he has a dud week this week because Jordan Love's not playing, then you could have a manager that's like, maybe I should have traded a long time ago, that I personally think will have a good rest of the season once Jordan Love's back because this offense is so good. So he's another guy that I think is really interesting too. And the last guy kind of, that I would say too, I still don't think people understand this. I kind of view him as like Joe Mixon-esque, Josh Jacobs. Like this is a guy who can
Yeah,
be a top
especially
5
down the
running back,
stretch. Yeah.
like down the stretch, because he's a workhorse running back.
Yep.
And this is a very, very good offense that you could probably get like Alvin Kamara for him and maybe another piece.
And a
Like
good
that's
piece
something that
too.
you could get. So those are kind of things that I'd be looking at as well.
Yeah, I kind of talk like Ramondre Stevenson's another name that's like, I think you can get at a really good discount. So you're looking for those superstars at a discount, that guys that could maybe, they've disappointed off of our draft day status, which I feel like is the biggest reason why people move off of players, because they
Yeah.
forget about the streaks. And I think it's easy to do that when you're a middling team too, and be like, I have to start to panic. I think this is the time to position and make your lineup filled with like potential hitters,
Mhm.
because once you get into the fantasy playoffs, you're going to face a tough team. You're going to face a team that's probably one of the better teams at the 3 seed if you're the 6 seed. And so you got to have hitters. You got to have players who maybe were disappointed to start the year but can finish strong.
And
And then
one
the
other
winning
thing too,
teams.
and I'll say this one last thing too. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
This is also it's kind of a tough game to play with these kind of teams because you could make some league altering decisions because I think a guy that I would definitely continue to stash is a guy like Blake Corum, but you could continue to stash him for the rest of the year and he does nothing for you. But who's to say in 4 weeks, Kyron Williams goes down. Now you have Blake Corum. Your team just takes that ultimate swing where you're this middling team where now you get Blake Corum
Yeah.
and he's probably going to be an RB1 in fantasy football. So it's one of those things where I would load up my team, but I would still keep a 1 or 2 guys at the end of my bench that are just stashes where if the player goes down in front of them, like this is a guy that just takes my team from a pretty like a good team to one of the elite teams in the league where that's just all I need. So that's kind of what I would do with these teams too.
Well, we're at a fragile time because there's been a lot of teams who've had their buys, and I would say probably after next week, after week 10, most of the teams have had their buys outside of like probably I would say more than half the teams will have had their buy after week 10. So it's like we're at a really fragile time because that's when people start getting rid of the fringe players. You start
Mhm.
getting rid of the fringe guys because you already pretty much got your starters locked in. So now I can get rid of, the Jerry Judys or the players who have been kind of like
Yeah.
middling players throughout the year.
Yeah.
That's the time they do it. So it's like you kind of want to be a week ahead and get the Blake Corum, but you also want to have players who can help you get the buy. So I would say
Mhm.
look at your roster, evaluate, make sure that you have players that are startable every week, But the minute that your buys are starting to get cleared up, that's the time to go get those guys.